welcome to Deerfield Public Library's Twitch channel. I'm Emily.
And I'm Christina.
And you are tuning in for Lunchtime Listens Twilight. We have 2 copies this time. So we'll each get to have our own copy to read along. I'm going to read chapter 7, and then Christina's going to read chapter 8. So here we go.
Let's do it.
Chapter 7, Nightmare. I told Charlie I had a lot of homework to do and that I didn't want anything to eat. There was a basketball game on that he was excited about, though of course I had no idea what was special about it, so he wasn't aware of anything unusual in my face or tone. It's just so mean to Charlie all the time. I have no idea. Anyways, once in my room, I locked the door. I dug through my desk until I found my old headphones, and I plugged them into my little CD player. I picked up a CD that Phil had given me for Christmas. It was one of his favorite bands, but they used a little too much bass and shrieking for my tastes. I popped it into place and lay down on my bed. I put on the headphones, hit play, and turned up the volume until it hurt my ears. I closed my eyes, but the light still intruded, so I added a pillow over the top half of my face. Oh, I didn't give you... Do you want to know what happened that made her so upset? I was like, I didn't give you any type of recap. So she's really upset because Jacob basically just spilled the beans that the Cullens are vampires. Oh. He, straight up says, the Cullens are the cold ones.
Was that at the beach?
Yes, yeah. When she went to the beach with Mike. And she spent literally the whole chapter flirting with Jacob to try and get him to tell her this stuff. So, it's a little her fault that he has such a huge crush on her later. So, spoiler alert, but... It was wild. I totally forgot how much she was milking it, and he's only he's 14 and she's 17, so there's I have so many questions. But so that's what she's so upset about, and what she's trying to drown out her thoughts with the music for. Recap done. Sorry about that. All right, there we go. I concentrated very carefully on the music, trying to understand the lyrics, to unravel the complicated drum patterns. By the 3rd time I'd listened through the CD, I knew all the words to the choruses at least. I was surprised to find that I really did like the band after all, once I got past the blaring noise. I'd have to thank Phil again. And it worked. The shattering beats made it impossible for me to think, which was the whole purpose of the exercise. I listened to the CD again and again until I was singing along with all the songs, until finally I fell asleep. I opened my eyes to a familiar place. Aware in some corner of my consciousness that I was dreaming, I recognized the green light of the forest. I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks somewhere nearby, and I knew that if I found the ocean, I'd be able to see the sun. I was trying to follow the sound, but then Jacob Black was there, tugging on my hand, pulling me back towards the blackest part of the forest. "Jacob, what's wrong?" I asked. His face was frightened as he yanked with all his strength against my resistance. I didn't want to go into the dark. "Run, Bella! You have to run!" he whispered, terrified. "This way, Bella!" I recognized Mike's voice calling out of the gloomy heart of the trees, but I couldn't see him. "Why?" I asked, still pulling against Jacob's grasp, desperate now to find the sun. But Jacob let go of my hand and yelped, suddenly shaking, falling to the dim forest floor. He twitched on the ground as I watched in horror. "Jacob!" I screamed, but he was gone. In his place was a large red-brown wolf with black eyes. Oh my gosh, I didn't know this foreshadowing. I didn't realize it was so early in the book. Oh my gosh.
I don't remember this dream.
This definitely didn't make it into the movie. All right. The wolf faced away from me, pointing towards the shore, the hair on the back of his shoulders bristling, low growls issuing from between his exposed fangs. "Bella, run!" Mike cried out again from behind me, but I didn't turn. I was watching a light coming towards me from the beach. And then Edward stepped out from the trees, his skin faintly glowing, his eyes black and dangerous. He held up one hand and beckoned me to come to him. The wolf growled at my feet. I took a step forward toward Edward. He smiled then, and his teeth were sharp, pointed. "Trust me," he purred. I took another step. The wolf launched himself across the space between me and the vampire, fangs aimed for the jugular. No! I screamed, wrenching upright out of my bed. My sudden movement caused the headphones to pull the CD player off the bedside table, and it clattered to the wooden floor. My light was still on, and I was sitting fully dressed on the bed with my shoes on. I glanced disorientated at the clock on my dresser. It was 5:30 in the morning. I groaned, fell back, and rolled over onto my face, kicking off my boots. I was too uncomfortable to get anywhere near sleep, though. I rolled back over and unbuttoned my jeans, yanking them off awkwardly as I tried to stay horizontal. I could feel the braid in my hair, an uncomfortable ridge along the back of my skull. I turned onto my side and ripped the rubber band out, quickly combing through the plaits with my fingers. I've never in my life pictured her wearing a braid because
I know. I'm like, wow, that's weird.
it took me a second to even get what she meant. Like, what do you mean your braid? I never.
That's so funny.
Never put Kay Stu's hair in a braid. It was no use, of course. My subconscious had dredged up exactly the images I had been trying so desperately to avoid. I was going to have to face them now. I sat up and my head spun for a minute as the blood flowed downward. First things first, I thought to myself, happy to put it off as long as possible. I grabbed my bathroom bag. The shower didn't last nearly as long as I hoped it would, though. Even taking the time to blow dry my hair, I was soon out of things to do in the bathroom. Wrapped in a towel, I crossed back to my room. I couldn't tell if Charlie was still asleep or if he had already left. I went to look out my window and the cruiser was gone, fishing again. I dressed slowly in my most comfy sweats and then made my bed, something I never did. I couldn't put it off any longer. I went to my desk and switched on my old computer. I hated using the internet here. My modem was sadly outdated, my free service substandard. Just dialing up took so long, I decided to go get myself a bowl of cereal while I waited. I can hear the tone in my head. Logging on. I ate slowly, chewing each bite with care. When I was done, I washed the bowl and spoon, dried them, and put them away. My feet dragged as I climbed the stairs. I went to my CD player first, picking it up off the floor and placing it precisely in the center of the table. I pulled out the headphones and put them away in the desk drawer. Then I turned the same CD on, turning it down to the point where it was background noise. With another sigh, I turned to my computer. Naturally, the screen was covered in pop-up ads. I sat in my hard folding chair and began closing all the little windows. Eventually, I made it to my favorite search engine. She can't name it.
Which one is it?
Which one? Is it Bing? It would
Drop the name.
It would be Bing.
Ew, I hate Bing. Sorry, Bing lovers. If there's any of you out there.
Bing slander. I shot down a few more pop-ups, then typed in one word. Vampire. It took an infuriatingly long time, of course. When the results came up, there was a lot to sift through. Everything from movies and TV shows to role-playing games, underground metal, and gothic cosmetic companies. Then I found a promising site, Vampires A to Z. I waited impatiently for it to load, quickly clicking it closed each ad that flashed across the screen. Finally, the screen was finished, simply white background with black text, academic looking. 2 quotes greeted me on the homepage. Throughout the vast, shadowy world of ghosts and demons, there is no figure so terrible, no figure so dreaded and abhorrent, yet dight with such fearful fascination as the vampire, who is himself neither ghost nor demon, but yet who partakes the dark natures and possesses the mysterious and terrible qualities of both. Reverend Montague Summers. If there is in this world a well-attested account, it is that of the vampires. Nothing is lacking. Official reports, affidavits of well-known people, of surgeons, of priests, of magistrates. The judicial proof is most complete. And with all that, who is there who believes in vampires? Rousseau. The rest of the site was an alphabetized list of all of the different myths of vampires held throughout the world. The first I clicked on, the Danag, was a Filipino vampire supposedly responsible for planting taro on the islands long ago. I love taro.
Thank the vampire.
Thanks, Danag. The myth continued that the Danag worked with humans for many years, but the partnership ended one day when a woman cut her finger and a Danag sucked her wounds, enjoying the taste so much that it drained her body completely of blood. I read carefully through the descriptions, looking for anything that sounded familiar, let alone plausible. It seemed that most vampire myths centered around beautiful women as demons and children as victims. They also seemed like constructs created to explain away the high mortality rates for young children and to give men an excuse for infidelity. Many of the stories involved bodiless spirits and warnings against improper burials. There wasn't much that sounded like the movies I'd seen, and only a very few, like the Hebrew Estri and the Polish Upier, who were even preoccupied with drinking blood. The only 3 entries that really caught my attention, the Romanian, geez Louise, thank you, Romanian Varacolani? I'm totally not saying that right.
I'm not sure about that word.
A powerful undead being who could appear as a beautiful pale-skinned human, the Slovak Nelepsy, a creature so strong and fast it could massacre an entire village in a single hour after midnight, and one other, the Stregononi Benefici. About this last there was only one brief sentence. Stregononi Benefici, an Italian vampire said to be on the side of goodness, and a mortal enemy of all evil vampires. That was a relief. That one small entry, the one myth among hundreds that claimed the existence of good vampires. Really great odds. Overall, though, there was little that coincided with Jacob's stories or my own observations. I'd made a little catalog in my head as I read and carefully compared it with each myth. Speed, strength, beauty, pale skin, eyes that shifted colors, and then Jacob's criteria. Blood drinkers, enemies of the werewolf, cold-skinned, and immortal. There were very few myths that matched even one factor. And then another problem, one that I'd remembered from a small number of scary movies I'd seen and was backed up by today's readings. Vampires couldn't come out in the daytime. The sun would burn them into cinder. They slept in coffins all day and came out at night. Aggravated, I snapped off the computer's main power switch, not waiting to shut things down properly. Through my irritation, I felt overwhelming embarrassment. It was all so stupid. I was sitting in my room researching vampires. What was wrong with me? I decided that most of the blame belonged on the doorstep of the town of Forks, and the entire Sodden Olympic Peninsula, for that matter. I had to get out of the house, but there was nowhere I wanted to go that didn't involve a 3-day drive. I pulled on my boots anyways, unclear where I was headed, and went downstairs. I shrugged into my raincoat without checking the weather and stomped out the door. It was overcast, but not raining yet. I ignored my truck and started east on foot, angling across Charlie's yard towards the ever-encroaching forest. It didn't take long till I was deep enough for the house and the road to be invisible, for the only sound to be the squish of the damp earth under my feet and the sudden cries of the jays. There was a thin ribbon of a trail that led through the forest here, or I wouldn't risk wandering on my own like this. My sense of direction was hopeless. I could get lost in much less helpful surroundings. It's a bit of foreshadowing, too. The trail wound deeper and deeper into the forest, mostly east as far as I could tell. It snaked around the Sitka spruces and the hemlocks and the yews and the maples. I only vaguely knew the names of the trees around me, and all I knew was due to Charlie pointing them out to me from the cruiser window in earlier days. There were many I didn't know, and others I couldn't be sure about because they were so covered in green parasites. I followed the trail as long as my anger at myself pushed me forward. As that started to ebb, I slowed. A few drops of moisture trickled down from the canopy above me, but I couldn't be certain if it was beginning to rain or if it was simply pools left over from yesterday, held high in the leaves above me, slowly dripping their way back to the earth. At a recently fallen tree, I knew it was recent because it wasn't entirely carpeted in moss, rested against the trunk of one of her sisters, creating a sheltered little bench just a few safe feet off the trail. I stepped over the ferns and sat carefully, making sure my jacket was between the damp seat and my clothes wherever they touched, and leaned my hooded head back against the living tree. This was the wrong place to have come. I should have known, but where else was there to go? The forest was deep green and far too much like the scene in last night's dream to allow for peace of mind. Now that there was no longer the sound of my soggy footsteps, the silence was piercing. The birds were quiet too, the drops increasing in frequency, so it must be raining above. The ferns stood higher than my head now that I was seated, and I knew someone could walk by on the path 3 feet away and not see me. Here in the trees, it was much easier to believe the absurdities that embarrassed me indoors. Nothing had changed in this forest for thousands of years, and all the myths and legends of 100 different lands seemed much more likely in this green haze than they had in my clear-cut bedroom. I forced myself to focus on the 2 most vital questions I had to answer, but I did so unwillingly. First, I had to decide if it was possible that what Jacob had said about the Cullens could be true. Immediately, my mind responded with a resounding negative. It was silly and morbid to entertain such ridiculous notions. But what then? I asked myself. There was no rational explanation for how I was alive at this moment. I listened against my head. I listed again in my head the things I'd observed myself: the impossible speed and strength, the eye color shifting from black to gold and back again, the inhumane beauty, the pale, frigid skin, and more small things that registered slowly, how they never seemed to eat, the disturbing grace with which they moved, and the way he sometimes spoke, with unfamiliar cadences and phrases that better fit the style of a turn-of-a-century novel than that of a 21st century classroom. He had skipped class the day when we'd done blood typing. He hadn't said no to the beach trip till he had heard where we were going. He seemed to know what everyone around him was thinking, except me. He had told me he was the villain, dangerous. Could the Cullens be vampires? I don't know. Well, they were something. Something outside the possibility of rational justification was taking place in front of my incredulous eyes. Whether it be Jacob's cold ones or my own superhero theory, Edward Cullen was not human. He was something more. So then maybe that would have to be my answer for now. And then the most important question of all, what was I going to do if it was true? If Edward was a vampire, I could hardly make myself think the words. Then what should I do? Involving someone else was definitely out. I couldn't even believe myself. Anyone I told would have me committed. Only 2 options seemed practical. The first was to take his advice, to be smart, to avoid him as much as possible, to cancel our plans, to go back to ignoring him as far as I was able, to pretend there was an impenetrably thick glass wall between us in the one class where we were forced together, to tell him to leave me alone and mean it this time. I was gripped with a sudden agony of despair as I considered that alternative. My mind rejected the pain quickly, skipping on to the next option. I could do nothing different. After all, if he was something sinister, he'd done nothing to hurt me so far. In fact, I would be a dent in Tyler's fender if he hadn't acted so quickly. So quickly, I argued with myself, that it might have been sheer reflexes. But if it was a reflex to save lives, how bad could it be? I retorted. My head spun around in answerless circles. There was one thing I was sure of, if I was sure of anything. The dark Edward in my dream last night was a reflection only of my fear of the word Jacob had spoken, and not Edward himself. Even so, when I'd screamed out in terror at the werewolf's lunge, it wasn't fear for the wolf that brought my cry of no to my lips. It was fear that he would be harmed. Even...
The truth comes out!
She knows. She knows. Oh, man. Even if he had called to me with sharpened fangs, I feared for him. That, like, italicized every time she, like, mentions him. I knew that I had my answer. I didn't know if there was ever a choice, really. I was already in too deep. Now that I knew, if I knew, I could do nothing about my frightening secret. Because when I thought of him, of his voice, his hypnotic eyes, the magnetic force of his personality, I wanted nothing more than to be with him right now. Even if, but I couldn't think of it. Not here, alone in the darkening forest. Not while the rain made it dim as twilight under the canopy and patterned my footsteps across the matted earth floor. I shivered and rose quickly from my place of concealment, worried that somehow the path would have disappeared with the rain. But it was there, safe and clear, winding its way out of the dripping green maze. I followed it hastily, my hood pulled close around my face, becoming surprised as I nearly ran through the trees at how far I'd come. I started to wonder if I was heading out at all or following the path further into the confines of the forest. Before I could get too panicky, though, I began to glimpse some open spaces through the webbed branches. And then I could hear a car passing on the street, and I was free. Charlie's lawn stretched out in front of me, the house beckoning me, promising warmth and dry socks. It was just noon when I got back inside. I went upstairs and got dressed for the day, jeans and a t-shirt, since I was staying indoors. It didn't take too much effort to concentrate on my task for the day, a paper on Macbeth that was due Wednesday. I settled into outlining a rough draft contentedly, more serene than I'd felt since Thursday afternoon, if I was being honest. That had always been my way, though. Making decisions was the painful part for me, the part I'd agonized over. But once the decision was made, I simply followed through, usually with relief that the choice was made. Sometimes the relief was tainted by despair, like my decision to come to Forks. But it was still better than wrestling with the alternatives. This decision was ridiculously easy to live with. Dangerously easy. She's maybe not got the best survival instincts. And so the day was quiet, productive. I finished my paper before 8. Charlie came home with a large catch, and I made a mental note to pick up a book of recipes for fish while I was in Seattle next week. The chills that were flashing up my spine whenever I thought of that trip were no different than the ones I felt before I'd taken my walk with Jacob Black. They should be different, I thought. I should be afraid. I knew I should be, but I couldn't feel that right kind of fear. I slept dreamlessly that night, exhausted from beginning my day so early and sleeping so poorly the night before. I woke for the second time since arriving in Forks to the bright yellow light of a sunny day. I skipped to the window, stunned to see that there was hardly a cloud in the sky, and those that were there just fleecy little white puffs that couldn't possibly be carrying any rain. I opened the window, surprised when it opened silently, without sticking, not having opened it for who knows how many years, and sucked in a relatively dry air. It was nearly warm and hardly windy at all. My blood was electric in my veins. Charlie was finishing breakfast when I came downstairs, and he picked up on my mood immediately. "Nice day out," he commented. "Yes," I agreed with a grin. He smiled back, his brown eyes crinkling around the edges. When Charlie smiled, it was easy to see why he and my mother had jumped too quickly into an early marriage. Most of the young romantic he'd been in those days had faded before I'd known him, as the curly brown hair, the same color if not the same texture as mine, had dwindled, slowly revealing more and more of the shiny skin of his forehead. It's the shade. But when he smiled, I could see a little of the man who had run away with Renee when she was just 2 years older than I was now. Wow. That is going to explain why they're so against her marriage later.
So they were 19?
Yeah, they must have been 19 when they got married. I forgot that detail. I ate breakfast cheerily, watching the dust motes stirring in the sunlight that streamed in the back window. Charlie called out a goodbye, and I heard the cruiser pull away from the house. I hesitated on my way to the door, hand on my rain jacket. It would be tempting fate to leave it at home. With a sigh, I folded it over my arm and stepped out into the brightest light I'd seen in months. By dint of much elbow grease, I was able to get both my windows in the truck almost completely rolled down. I was one of the first ones to school. I hadn't even checked the clock in my hurry to get outside. I parked and headed towards the seldom used picnic benches on the south side of the cafeteria. The benches were still a little damp, so I sat on my jacket, glad to have a use for it. My homework was done, the product of a slow social life, but there were a few trig problems I wasn't sure I had right. I took out my book industriously, but halfway through rechecking the first problem, I was daydreaming, watching the sunlight play on the red-barked trees. I sketched inattentively along the margins of my homework. After a few minutes, I suddenly realized I'd drawn 5 pairs of dark eyes staring out of the page at me. I scrubbed them out with an eraser. "Bella!" I heard someone call. It sounded like Mike. I looked around and realized that the school had become populated while I'd been sitting there, absent-minded. Everyone was in t-shirts, some even in shorts, though the temperature couldn't have been over 60. Mike was coming towards me in khaki shorts and a striped rugby shirt, waving. "Hey, Mike," I called, waving back, unable to be half-hearted on a morning like this. He came to sit by me, the tidy spikes of his hair shining gold in the light, his grin stretching across his face. He was so delighted to see me, I couldn't help but feel gratified. "I never noticed before. Your hair has red in it," he commented, catching between his fingers a strand that fluttered on the light breeze. "Only in the sun." I became just a little uncomfortable as he tucked the lock behind my ear. Yeah, I feel a little uncomfortable too. "Great day, isn't it?" "My kind of day," I agreed. "What did you do yesterday?" His tone was just a bit too proprietary. "I mostly worked on my essay. I didn't add that I was finished with it. No need to sound smug." He hit his forehead with the heel of his hand. "Oh yeah, that's due Thursday, right?" Wednesday, I think." "Wednesday?" He frowned. "That's not good. What are you writing yours on?" "Whether Shakespeare's treatment of the female characters are misogynistic?" Good topic. He stared at me like I'd just spoken pig Latin. "I guess I'll have to get to work on that tonight," he said, deflated. "I was going to ask if you wanted to go out." "Oh," I was taken off guard. Why couldn't I ever have a pleasant conversation with Mike anymore without getting awkward? "Well, we could go to dinner or something, and I could work on it later." He smiled at me hopefully. "Mike," I hated being put on the spot, "I don't think that would be the best idea." His face fell. "Why?" he asked, his eyes guarded. My thoughts flickered to Edward, wondering if that's where his thoughts were as well. "I think, and if you ever repeat what I'm saying right now, I will cheerfully beat you to death," I threatened. "But I think that it would hurt Jessica's feelings." He was bewildered, obviously not thinking in that direction at all. "Jessica? Really, Mike? Are you blind?" "Oh," he exhaled, clearly dazed. I took advantage of that to make my escape. "It's time for class and I can't be late again." I gathered my books up and stuffed them in my bag. We walked in silence to Building 3, and his expression was distracted. I hoped whatever thoughts he was immersed in was leading him in the right direction. When I saw Jessica and Trig, she was bubbling with enthusiasm. She, Angela, and Lauren were going to Port Angeles tonight to go dress shopping for the dance, and she wanted me to come too, even though I didn't need one. I was indecisive. as always. It doesn't say that. That was me.
I was like, someone's throwing shade.
She said it earlier herself, so. I mean, gosh, yeah, we're only 145 pages in. I'm getting sassy back at her already.
Decisions are hard.
They are. I'll give her that. It would be nice to get out of town with some girlfriends, but Lauren would be there. And who knew what I could be doing tonight? But that was definitely the wrong path to let my mind wander down. Of course, I was happy about the sunlight, but that wasn't completely reasonable for the euphoric mood I was in. Not even close. So I gave her a maybe, telling her I'd have to talk with Charlie first. She talked of nothing but the dance on the way to Spanish, continuing as if without an interruption. Continuing as if without an interruption when class finally ended, 5 minutes late, and we were on our way to lunch. I was far too lost in my own frenzy of anticipation to notice much of what she said. I was painfully eager to see not just him, but all the Cullens, to compare them with my new suspicions that plagued my mind. As I crossed the threshold of the cafeteria, I felt the first true tingle of fear slither down my spine and settle in my stomach. Would they be able to know what I was thinking? And then a different feeling jolted through me. Would Edward be waiting to sit with me again? As was my routine, I glanced first towards the Cullens' table. A shiver of panic trembled in my stomach as I realized it was empty. With dwindling hope, my eyes scoured the rest of the cafeteria, hoping to find him alone, waiting for me. The place was nearly filled. Spanish had made us late, but there was no sign of Edward or any of his family. Desolation hit me with a crippling strength. I shambled along behind Jessica, not bothering to pretend to listen anymore. We were late enough that everyone was already at our table. I avoided the empty chair next to Mike in favor of one by Angela. I vaguely noticed that Mike held the chair out politely for Jessica and that her face lit up in response. Angela was asked a few quiet questions about the Macbeth paper, which I answered as naturally as I could while spiraling downward in my misery. She, too, invited me to go with them tonight, and I agreed now, grasping at anything to distract myself. I realized I'd been holding on to the last shred of hope when I entered biology, saw his empty seat, and felt a new wave of disappointment. The rest of the day passed slowly, dismally. In gym, we had a lecture on the rules of badminton, the next torture they had lined up for me. But at least it meant I got to sit and listen instead of stumbling around on the court. The best part was that the coach didn't finish, so I got another day off tomorrow. Never mind that the day after they would arm me with a racket before unleashing me on the rest of the class. I was glad to leave campus, so I would be free to pout and mope before I went out tonight with Jessica and company. But right after I walked in the doors of Charlie's house, Jessica called to cancel our plans. I tried to be happy that Mike had asked her out to dinner. I really was relieved that he finally seemed to be catching on, but my enthusiasm sounded false in my own ears. She rescheduled our shopping trip for tomorrow night, which left me with little in the way of distractions. I had fish marinating for dinner, with a salad and bread left in the oven from the night before, so there was nothing to do there. I spent a focused half hour on homework, but then I was through with that too. I checked my email, reading the backlog of letters from my mother, getting snippier as they progressed to the present. I sighed and typed a quick response. Mom, sorry I've been out. I went to the beach with some friends, and I had to write a paper. My excuses were fairly pathetic, so I gave up on that. It's sunny outside today. I know, I'm shocked too. So I'm going to go outside and soak up as much vitamin D as I can. I love you, Bella. I decided to kill another hour with non-school related readings. I had a small collection of books that came with me to Forks, the shabbiest volume being a compilation of Jane Austen. I selected that one and headed to the backyard, grabbing a ragged old quilt from the linen cupboard at the top of the stairs on my way down. Outside in Charlie's small square yard, I folded the quilt in half and laid it down out of reach of the tree's shadows on the thick lawn that would always be slightly wet, no matter how long the sun shone. I lay on my stomach, crossing my ankles in the air, flipping through the different novels in the book, trying to decide which would occupy my mind most thoroughly. My favorites were Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. I'd read the first most recently, so I started into Sense and Sensibility, only to remember after I began chapter 3 that the hero of the story happened to be named Edward. Angrily, I turned to Mansfield Park, but the hero of that piece was named Edmund, and that was just too close. Weren't there any other names available in the late 18th century? I snapped the book shut, annoyed, and rolled over onto my back. I pushed my sleeves up as high as they would go and closed my eyes. I would think of nothing but the warmth on my skin, I told myself severely. The breeze was still light, but it blew tendrils of my hair around my face, and that tickled a bit. I pulled all my hair over my head, letting it fan out on the quilt above me, and focused again on the heat that touched my eyelids, my cheekbones, my nose, my lips, my forearms, my neck, soaked through my light shirt. The next thing I was conscious of was the sound of Charlie's cruiser turning onto the bricks of the driveway. I sat up in surprise, realizing the light was gone beyond the trees, and I had fallen asleep. I looked around, muddled in the sudden feeling that I wasn't alone. "Charlie?" I asked, but I could hear his door slamming in the front of the house. I jumped up, foolishly edgy, gathering the now damp quilt and my book. I ran inside to get some oil heating on the stove, realizing that dinner would be late. Charlie was hanging up his gun belt and stepped out of his boots when I came in. "Sorry, Dad, dinner's not ready yet. I fell asleep outside." I stifled a yawn. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I wanted to catch the score on the game anyways." I watched TV with Charlie after dinner for something to do. There wasn't anything I wanted to watch, but he knew I didn't like basketball, so he turned it to some mindless sitcom that neither of us enjoyed. He seemed happy, though, to be doing something together. So sweet. Aww. He's trying so hard. Felt so good, despite my depression, to make him happy. That's good, at least. "Dad," I said during a commercial, "Jessica and Angela are going to look for dresses for the dance tomorrow night in Port Angeles, and they wanted me to help them choose. Do you mind if I go with them?" "Jessica Stanley?" he asked. "And Angela Weber," I sighed as I gave him the details. He was confused. "But you're not going to the dance, right?" "No, Dad, but I'm helping them find dresses. You know, giving them constructive criticism. I wouldn't have to explain this to a woman." "Well, okay." He seemed to realize that he was out of his depth with the girly stuff. "It is a school night, though. We'll leave right after school so we can get back early. You'll be okay with dinner, right?" "Bells, I fed myself for 17 years before you got here," he reminded me. "I don't know how you survived," I muttered, then added more clearly, "I'll leave some things for cold-cut sandwiches in the fridge, okay? Right on top." It was sunny again in the morning. I awakened with renewed hope that I grimly tried to suppress. I dressed for the warmer weather in a deep blue V-neck blouse, something I'd worn in the dead of winter in Phoenix. I'd planned my arrival at school so I barely had time to make it to class. With a sinking heart, I circled the full lot to look for a space while also searching for the silver Volvo that was clearly not there. I parked in the last row and hurried to English, arriving breathless but subdued before the final bell. It was the same as yesterday. I just couldn't keep little sprouts of hope from budding in my mind, only to have them squashed painfully as I searched the lunchroom in vain and sat in my empty biology table. The Port Angeles scheme was back on for tonight and made all the more attractive by the fact that Lauren had other obligations. Bye, Lauren. I was anxious to get out of town so I could stop glancing over my shoulder, hoping to see him appear out of the blue the way he always did. I vowed to myself that I would be in a good mood tonight and not ruin Angela or Jessica's enjoyment in the dress hunting. Maybe I could do a little clothes shopping as well. I refused to think that I might be shopping alone in Seattle this weekend, no longer interested in the earlier arrangement. Surely he wouldn't cancel without at least telling me. After school, Jessica followed me home in her old white Mercury so that I could ditch my books and truck. I brushed through my hair quickly when I was inside, feeling a slight lift of excitement as I contemplated getting out of Forks. I left a note for Charlie on the table, explaining again where to find dinner, switched my scruffy wallet from my bag purse to a purse I rarely used, and ran out to join Jessica. We went to Angela's house next, and she was waiting for us. My excitement increased exponentially as we drove out of the town limits. Bye, Forks.
Chapter 8, Port Angeles. Jess drove faster than the chief, so we made it to Port Angeles by 4. It had been a while since I'd had a girls' night out, and the estrogen rush was invigorating. We listened to whiny rock songs while Jessica jabbered on about the boys we hung out with. Jessica's dinner with Mike had gone very well, and she was hoping that by Saturday night they would have progressed to the first kiss stage. I smiled to myself, pleased. Angela was passively happy to be going to the dance, but not really interested in Eric. Just tried to get her to confess who her type was, but I interrupted with a question about dresses after a bit to spare her. Angela threw a grateful glance my way. Port Angeles was a beautiful little tourist trap, much more polished and quaint than Forks. But Jessica and Angela knew it well, so they didn't plan to waste time on the picturesque boardwalk by the bay. Jess drove straight to the one big department store in town, which was a few streets in from the Bay Area's visitor-friendly face. The dance was billed as semi-formal, and we weren't exactly sure what that meant. Both Jessica and Angela seemed surprised and almost disbelieving when I told them I'd never been to a dance in Phoenix. Didn't you ever go with a boyfriend or something? Jess asked dubiously as we walked through the front doors of the store. Really, I tried to convince her, not wanting to confess my dancing problems. I've never had a boyfriend or anything close. I didn't go out much. Why not? Jessica demanded. No one asked me, I answered honestly. She looked skeptical. People ask you out here, she reminded me, and you tell them no. We were in the junior section now, scanning the racks for dress-up clothes. Well, except for Tyler, Angela amended quietly. Excuse me? What did you say? Tyler told everyone he's taking you to prom. Jessica poured me with suspicious eyes. He said, what? I sounded like I was choking. I told you it wasn't true, Angela murmured to Jessica. I was silent, still lost in shock that was quickly turning into irritation. But we had found the dress racks, and now we had work to do. That's why Lauren doesn't like you, Jessica giggled while we pawed through the clothes. I ground my teeth. Do you think that if I ran him over with my truck, he would stop feeling guilty about the accident? That he might give up on making amends and call it even? Maybe, Jess snickered, if that's why he's doing this. The dress selection wasn't large, but both of them found a few things to try on. I sat on a low chair just inside the dressing room by the three-way mirror, trying to control my fuming. Jess was torn between two. One, a long strapless basic black number. The other, a knee-length electric blue with spaghetti straps. I encouraged her to go with the blue. Why not play up with the eyes? Angela chose a pale pink dress that draped around her tall frame nicely and brought out honey tints in her light brown hair. I complimented them both generously and helped by returning the rejects to their racks.
That was a lot of R words.
Oh my gosh,
right
yeah. Returning the rejects to the racks.
That was a tongue twister.
The whole process was much shorter and easier than similar trips I'd taken with Renee at home. I guess there was something to be said for limited choices. We headed over to shoes and accessories. While they tried things on, I merely watched and critiqued, not in the mood to shop for myself, though I did need new shoes. The girls' night high was wearing off in the wake of my annoyance at Tyler, leaving room for the gloom to move back in. Angela, I began, hesitant, while she was trying on a pair of pink strappy heels. She was overjoyed to have a date tall enough that she could wear high heels at all. Jessica had drifted to the jewelry counter, and we were alone. Yes, she held her leg out, twisting her ankle to get a better view of the shoe. I chickened out. I like those. I think I'll get them, though they'll never match anything but the one dress, she mused. Oh, go ahead. They're on sale, I encouraged. She smiled, putting the lid back on the box that contained more practical-looking off-white shoes. I tried again. Angela? She looked up curiously. Is it normal for the Cullens... I kept my eyes on the shoes. To be out of school a lot? I failed miserably in my attempt to sound nonchalant. Yes, when the weather's good, they go backpacking all the time, even the doctor. They're all real outdoorsy, she told me quietly, examining her shoes, too. She didn't ask one question, let alone the hundreds that Jessica would have unleashed. I was beginning to really like Angela. Oh, I let the subject drop as Jessica returned to show us the rhinestone jewelry she'd found to match her silver shoes. We planned to go to dinner at a little Italian restaurant on the boardwalk, but the dress shopping hadn't taken as long as we'd expected. Jess and Angela were going to take their clothes back to the car and then walk down to the bay. I told them I would meet them at the restaurant in an hour. I wanted to look for a bookstore. They were both willing to come with me, but I encouraged them to go have fun and they didn't know how preoccupied I could get when surrounded by books. It was something I preferred to do alone. They walked off to the car, chattering happily, and I headed in the direction Jess pointed out. I had no trouble finding the bookstore, but it wasn't what I was looking for. The windows were full of crystals, dream catchers, and books about spiritual healing. I didn't even go inside. Through the glass, I could see a 50-year-old woman with long gray hair worn straight down her back, clad in a dress right out of the 60s, smiling welcomingly from behind the counter. I decided that was one conversation I could skip. There had to be a normal bookstore in town.
So mean.
I wandered through the streets, which was filling up with end-of-the-workday traffic, and hoped I was headed toward downtown. It's weird to think that, I was like, why didn't you just look it up? On her phone, but
I had a moment too, yeah.
Wasn't a thing. I was like, I don't understand. Why didn't you look it up? I wasn't paying as much attention as I should to where I was going. I was wrestling with despair. I was trying so hard not to think about him and what Angela had said, and more than anything trying to beat down my hopes for Saturday, fearing a disappointment more painful than the rest, when I looked up to see someone's silver Volvo parked along the street, and it all came crashing down on me. Stupid, unreliable vampire, I thought to myself. I stomped along in a southerly direction towards some glass-fronted shops that looked promising, but when I got to them, they were just a repair shop and a vacant space. I still had too much time to go looking for Jess and Angela yet, and I decided I definitely needed to get my mood in hand before I met back up with them. I ran my fingers through my hair a couple of times and took some deep breaths before I continued around the corner. I started to realize, as I crossed another road, that I was going the wrong direction. The little foot traffic I had seen was going north, and it looked like the buildings here were mostly warehouses. I decided to turn east at the next corner and then loop around after a few blocks and try my luck on a different street on my way back to the boardwalk. A group of 4 men turned around the corner I was heading for, dressed too casually to be heading home from the office, but they were too grimy to be tourists. As they approached me, I realized they weren't too many years older than I was. They were joking loudly among themselves, laughing raucously and punching each other's arms. I scooted as far to the inside of the sidewalk as I could to give them room, walking swiftly, looking past them to the corner. "Hey there," one of them called as they passed, and he had to be talking to me since no one else was around. I glanced up automatically. 2 of them had paused. The other 2 were slowing. The closest, a heavy-set, dark-haired man in his early 20s, seemed to be the one who had spoken. He was wearing a flannel shirt open over a dirty t-shirt, cut-off jeans, and sandals. He took half a step toward me. "Hello," I mumbled, a knee-jerk reaction. Then I quickly looked away and walked faster toward the corner. I could hear them laughing at full volume behind me. "Hey, wait," one of them called after me again, but I kept my head down and rounded the corner with a sigh of relief. I could still hear them chortling behind me. I found myself on a sidewalk leading past the backs of several somber-colored warehouses, each with large bay doors for unloading trucks, padlocked for the night. The south side of the street had no sidewalk, only a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire protecting some kind of engine parts storage yard. I wandered far past the part of Port Angeles that I, as a guest, was intended to see. It was getting dark, I realized, the clouds finally returning, piling up on the western horizon, creating an early sunset. The eastern sky was still clear, but graying, shot through with streaks of pink and orange. I'd left my jacket in the car, and a sudden shiver made me cross my arms tightly across my chest. A single van passed me, and then the road was empty. The sky suddenly darkened further, and as I looked over my shoulder to glare at the offending cloud, I realized with a shock that 2 men were walking quietly 20 feet behind me. They were from the same group I'd passed at the corner, though neither was the dark one who'd spoken to me. I turned my head forward at once, quickening my pace. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather made me shiver again. My purse was on a shoulder strap, and I had it slung across my body, the way you were supposed to wear it so it wouldn't get snatched. I knew exactly where my pepper spray was. Still in my duffel bag, under the bed, never unpacked.
Bella.
I didn't have much money with me, just a 20 and some ones, and I thought about accidentally dropping my bag and walking away. But a small, frightening voice in the back of my mind warned me that they might be something worse than thieves. I listened intently to their quiet dude, don't drop your bag if you've got your ID in it. Like,
I can find you.
Yeah. I listened intently to their quiet footsteps, which were much too quiet when compared to the boisterous noise they'd been making earlier, and it didn't sound like they were speeding up or getting any closer to me. Breathe, I had to remind myself. You don't know they're following you. I continued to walk as quickly as I could without actually running, focusing on the right-hand turn that was only a few yards away from me now. I could hear them, staying as far back as they'd been before. A blue car turned onto the street from the south and drove quickly past me. I thought of jumping out in front of it, but I hesitated, inhibited, unsure that I was really being pursued. And then it was too late. I reached the corner, but a swift glance revealed that it was only a blind drive to the back of another building. I was half turned in anticipation. I had to hurriedly correct and dash across the narrow drive back to the sidewalk. The street ended at the next corner, where there was a stop sign. I concentrated on the faint footsteps behind me, deciding whether or not to run. They sounded further back, though, and I knew that they could outrun me in any case. I was sure to trip and go sprawling if I tried to go any faster. The footfalls were definitely further back. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder, and they were maybe 40 feet back now, I saw with relief, but they were both staring at me. Creepy. It seemed to take forever for me to get to the corner. I kept my pace steady, the men behind me falling ever so slightly further behind with every step. Maybe they realized they had scared me and were sorry. I saw 2 cars going north past the intersection I was headed for, and I exhaled in relief. There would be more people around once I got off this deserted street. I skipped around the corner with a grateful sigh and skidded to a stop. The street was lined on both sides by blank, doorless, windowless walls. I could see in the distance 2 intersections down, street lamps, cars, and more pedestrians, but they were all too far away, because lounging against the western building midway down the street were the other 2 men from the group, both watching with excited smiles as I froze dead on the sidewalk. I realized then that I wasn't being followed. I was being herded. Dude, I forgot, that they, didn't just, follow her, stumble upon her. They really,
This was an effort.
Yeah. Ugh. I paused for only a second, but it felt like a very long time. I turned then and darted to the other side of the road. I had a sinking feeling that it was a wasted attempt. The footsteps behind me were louder now. There you are, the booming voice of the stocky, dark-haired man shattered the intense quiet and made me jump. In the gathering darkness, it seemed like he was looking past me. Yeah, a voice called loudly from behind me, making me jump again as I tried to hurry down the street. We just took a little detour. My steps had to slow now. I was closing the distance between myself and the lounging pair too quickly. I had a good loud scream, and I sucked in air preparing to use it, but my throat was so dry I wasn't sure how much volume I could manage. With a quick movement, I slipped my purse over my head, gripping the strap with one hand, ready to surrender it or use it as a weapon as need demanded. The thick-set man shrugged away from the wall as I wearily came to a stop and walked slowly into the street. Stay away from me, I warned, in a voice that was supposed to sound strong and fearless. But I was right about the dry throat. No volume. Don't be like that, sugar, he called, and the raucous laughter started again behind me. I braced myself, feet apart, trying to remember through my panic what little self-defense I knew. Heel of the hand thrust upward, hopefully breaking the nose or shoving it into the brain. Finger through the eye socket. Try to hook around and pop the eye out. And the standard knee to the groin, of course. That same pessimistic voice in my head spoke up then, reminding me that I probably wouldn't have a chance against one of them, and there were 4. Shut up, I commanded the voice before terror could incapacitate me. I wasn't going out without taking someone with me. I tried to swallow so I could build up a decent scream. Headlights suddenly flew around the corner, the car almost hitting the stocky one, forcing him to jump back toward the sidewalk. I drove into the road. This car was going to stop or have to hit me. But the silver car unexpectedly fishtailed around, skidding to a stop with the passenger door open just a few feet from me. Get in, a furious voice commanded. It was amazing how instantaneously the choking fear vanished, amazing how suddenly the feeling of security washed over me, even before I was off the street, as soon as I heard his voice. I jumped into the seat, slamming the door shut behind me. It was dark in the car. No light had come on with the opening of the door, and I could barely see his face in the glow from the dashboard. The tires squealed as he spun around to face north, accelerating too quickly, swerving toward the stunned men on the street. I caught a glimpse of them diving for the sidewalk as he straightened out and sped toward the harbor. "Put on your seatbelt," he commanded, and I realized I was clutching the seat with both hands. I quickly obeyed. The snap as the belt connected was loud in the darkness. He took a sharp left, racing forward, blowing through several stop signs without a pause. But I felt utterly safe and, for the moment, totally unconcerned about where we were going.
It never says it was Edward. Like, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Like, it says this car's gonna stop. It never actually says it's Edward. Like it's gonna go into like a conversation and it's gonna become obvious, but like she just got into the car with a stranger.
Yeah. Yep.
Sorry, I was so distracted by that. I was like waiting for her to say, "Oh, and Edward was there."
Yeah.
Nope.
No. I mean, I guess we just know the Volvo and her relief.
I know, right? Oh my gosh. All right, sorry.
No, it's okay. But I felt utterly safe and for the moment totally unconcerned about where we were going. I stared at his face in profound relief that went beyond my sudden deliverance. I studied his flawless features in the limited light, waiting for my breath to return to normal, until it occurred to me that his expression was murderously angry. "Are you okay?" I asked, surprised at how hoarse my voice sounded. "No," he said curtly, and his tone was livid. I sat in silence, watching his face while his blazing eyes stared straight ahead until the car came to a sudden stop. I glanced around, but it was too dark to see anything beside the vague outline of dark trees crowding the roadside. We weren't in town anymore. "Bella?" he asked, his voice tight, controlled. "Yes?" My voice was still rough. I tried to clear my throat quietly. "Are you all right?" He still didn't look at me, but the fury was plain on his face. "Yes," I croaked softly. "Distract me, please," he ordered. "I'm sorry, what?" He exhaled sharply. "Just prattle about something unimportant until I calm down," he clarified, closing his eyes and pinching the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. I racked my brain for something trivial. "I'm going to run over Tyler Crowley tomorrow before school." He was still squeezing his eyes closed, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "Why?" "He's telling everyone that he's taking me to prom. Either he's insane or he's still trying to make up for almost killing me last. Well, you remember it. And he thinks prom is somehow the correct way to do this. So I figure if I endanger his life, then we're even, and he can't keep trying to make amends. I don't need enemies, and maybe Lauren would back off if he left me alone. I might have to total his Sentra, though. If he doesn't have a ride, he can't take anyone to prom," I babbled on. I heard about this. Good planning. I heard about that. He sounded a bit more composed. "You did?" I asked in disbelief, my previous irritation flaring. "If he's paralyzed from the neck down, he can't go to prom either," I muttered, refining my plan. Edward sighed and finally opened his eyes. "Better?" "Not really." I waited, but he didn't speak again. He leaned his head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling of the car. His face was rigid. "What's wrong?" My voice came out.
What's wrong? What could be wrong?
"Sometimes I have a problem with my temper, Bella." He was whispering too, and as he stared out the window, his eyes narrowed into slits. "But it wouldn't be helpful for me to turn around and hunt down those..." He didn't finish his sentence, looking away, struggling for a moment to control his anger again. "At least," he continued, "that's what I'm trying to convince myself." Oh, the word seemed inadequate, but I couldn't think of a better response. We sat in silence again. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was past 6:30. Jessica and Angela would be worried, I murmured. I was supposed to meet them. He started the engine without another word, turning around smoothly and speeding back toward town. We were under the streetlights in no time at all, still going too fast, weaving with ease through the cars, slowly cruising the boardwalk. He parallel parked against the curb in a space I would have thought much too small for the Volvo, but he slid in effortlessly in one try. I looked out the window to see the lights of La Bella Italia and Jess and Angela just leaving, pacing anxiously away from us. "How did you know where..." I began, but then I just shook my head. I heard the door open and turned to see him getting out. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm taking you to dinner." He smiled slightly, but his eyes were hard. He stepped out of the car and slammed the door. I fumbled with my seatbelt and then hurried to get out of the car as well. He was waiting for me on the sidewalk. He spoke before I could. Go stop Jessica and Angela before I have to track them down too. I don't think I could restrain myself if I ran into your other friends again. I shivered at the threat in his voice. Jess, Angela, I yelled after them, waving when they turned. They rushed back to me, the pronounced relief on both their faces simultaneously changing to surprise as they saw who I was standing next to. They hesitated a few feet from us. Where have you been? Jessica's voice was suspicious. I got lost. Don't be suspicious.
Don't be suspicious. Don't be suspicious.
I got lost, I admitted sheepishly, and then I ran into Edward. I gestured toward him. Would it be all right if I joined you, he asked, in his silken, irresistible voice. I could see from their staggered expressions that he had never unleashed his talents on them before. Sure, Jessica breathed. Actually, Bella, we already ate while we were waiting. Sorry, Angela confessed. That's fine. I'm not hungry, I shrugged. I think you should eat something. Edward's voice was low, but full of authority. He looked up at Jessica and spoke slightly louder. Do you mind if I drive Bella home tonight? That way you won't have to wait while she eats? No problem, I guess. She bit her lip, trying to figure out from my expression whether that was what I wanted. I winked at her. I wanted nothing more than to be alone with my perpetual savior. There were so many questions that I couldn't bombard him with till we were by ourselves. Okay, Angela was quicker than Jessica. See you tomorrow, Bella, Edward. She grabbed Jessica's hand and pulled her toward the car, which I could see a little ways away, parked across First Street. As they got in, Jess turned and waved, her face eager with curiosity. I waved back, waiting for them to drive away before I turned to face him. Honestly, I'm not hungry, I insisted, looking up to scrutinize his face. His expression was unreadable. Humor me. He walked to the door of the restaurant, and I held it open with an obstinate expression. Obviously, there would be no further discussion. I walked past him into the restaurant with a resigned sigh. The restaurant wasn't crowded. It was the off-season in Port Angeles. The host was female, and I understood the look in her eyes as she assessed Edward. She welcomed him a little more warmly than necessary. I was surprised by how much that bothered me.
Oh, gosh.
She was several inches taller than I was and unnaturally blonde. A table for two? Her voice was alluring, whether he was aiming for that or not. I saw her eyes flicker to me and then away, satisfied by my obvious ordinariness.
Ordinariness. I don't know if that's a word.
Is that a word? Ordinariness? Okay.
And made that one up.
And by the cautious, no contact space Edward kept between us. She led us to a table big enough for four in the center of the most crowded area of the dining floor. I was about to sit, but Edward shook his head at me. Perhaps something more private? He insisted quietly to the host. I wasn't sure, but it looked like he smoothly handed her a tip. I'd never seen anyone refuse a table except in old movies. Sure, she sounded as surprised as I was. She turned and led us around a partition to a small ring of booths, all of them empty. How's this? Perfect. He flashed his gleaming smile, dazing her momentarily. She shook her head, blinking. Your server will be right out. She walked away unsteadily. You really shouldn't do that to people, I criticized. It's hardly fair. Do what? Dazzle them like that. She's probably hyperventilating in the kitchen right now. He seemed confused. Oh, come on, I said dubiously. You have to know the effect you have on people. He tilted his head to one side, and his eyes were curious. I dazzle people? You haven't noticed? Do you think everybody gets their way so easily? He ignored my questions. Do I dazzle you? Frequently, I admitted. And then our server arrived, her face expectant. The hostess had definitely dished behind the scenes, and this new girl didn't look disappointed. She flipped a strand of short black hair behind one ear and smiled with unnecessary warmth. Hello, my name is Amber, and I'll be your server tonight. What can I get you to drink? I didn't miss that she was speaking only to him. Rude.
Mm-hmm.
He looked at me. I'll have a Coke. It sounded like a question. 2 Cokes, he said. I'll be right back with that, she assured him with another unnecessary smile, but he didn't see it. He was watching me. What? I asked when she left. His eyes stayed fixed on my face. How are you feeling? I'm fine, I replied, surprised by his intensity. You don't feel dizzy, sick, cold? Should I? He chuckled at my puzzled tone. Well, I'm actually waiting for you to go into shock. His face twisted up into that perfect crooked smile. I don't think that will happen, I said, after I could breathe again. I've always been very good at repressing unpleasant things. Just the same, I'll feel better when you have some sugar and food in you. Right on cue, the waitress appeared with our drinks and a basket of breadsticks. She stood with her back to me as she placed them on the table. Are you ready to order? She asked Edward. Bella? He asked. She turned unwillingly toward me. I picked the first thing I saw on the menu. I'll have the mushroom ravioli. And you? She turned back to him with a smile. Nothing for me, he said. Of course not. Let me know if you change your mind. The coy smile was still in place, but he wasn't looking at her, and she left dissatisfied. Drink, he ordered. I sipped at my soda obediently, and then drank more deeply, surprised by how thirsty I was. I realized I had finished the whole thing when he pushed his glass toward me. Thanks, I muttered, still thirsty. The cold from the icy soda was radiating through my chest, and I shivered. Are you cold? It's just the Coke, I explained, shivering again. Don't you have a jacket? His voice was disapproving. Yes. I looked at the empty bench next to me. Oh, I left it in Jessica's car, I realized. Edward was shrugging out of his jacket. I suddenly realized I had never once noticed what he was wearing. Not just tonight, but ever. I just couldn't seem to look away from his face. I made myself look now, focusing. He was removing a light beige leather jacket now. Underneath, he wore an ivory turtleneck sweater. It fit him snugly, emphasizing how muscular his chest was.
What teenager dresses this way? No!
He's not a teenager.
What?
He handed me the jacket, interrupting my ogling. Thanks, I said again, sliding my arms into his jacket. It was cold. The way my jacket felt when I first picked it up in the morning, hanging in the drafty hallway. I shivered again. It smelled amazing. I inhaled, trying to identify the delicious scent. It didn't smell like cologne. The sleeves were much too long. I shoved them back so I could free my hands. That color blue looks lovely with your skin, he said, watching me. I was surprised. I looked down, flushing, of course. He pushed the breadbasket toward me. Really, I'm not going into shock, I protested. You should be. A normal person would be. You don't even look shaken. He seemed unsettled. He stared into my eyes, and I saw how light his eyes were, lighter than I'd ever seen them, golden butterscotch. I feel very safe with you, I confessed, mesmerized into telling the truth again. That displeased him. His alabaster brow furrowed. He shook his head, frowning. This is more complicated than I'd planned, he murmured to himself. I picked up a breadstick and began nibbling on the end, measuring his expression. I wondered when it would be okay to start questioning him. Usually you're in a better mood when your eyes are so light, I commented, trying to distract him from whatever thought had left him frowning and somber. He stared at me, stunned. What? You're always crabbier when your eyes are black. I expected then, I went on. I have a theory about that. His eyes narrowed. More theories? I chewed on a small bite of the bread, trying to look indifferent. I hope you were more creative this time, or are you still stealing from comic books? His faint smile was mocking. His eyes were still tight. Well, no, I didn't get it from a comic book, but I didn't come up with it on my own either, I confessed. And, he prompted. But then the waitress strode around the partition with my food. I realized we'd been unconsciously leaning toward each other across the table because we both straightened up as she approached. She set the dish in front of me, it looked pretty good, and turned quickly to Edward. Did you change your mind? She asked. Isn't there anything I can get you? I may have been imagining the double meaning in her words.
Is there anything I can get you?
No, thank you, but some more soda would be nice. He gestured with a long white hand to the empty cups in front of me. Sure. She removed the empty glasses and walked away. You were saying? He asked. I'll tell you about in the car. If... I paused. There are conditions? He raised one eyebrow, his voice ominous. I do have a few questions first. Of course. The waitress was back with 2 more Cokes. She sat them down without a word this time and left again. I took a sip. Well, go ahead. He pushed, his voice still hard. I started with the most undemanding, or so I thought. Why are you in Port Angeles? He looked down, folding his large hands together slowly on the table. His eyes flickered up at me from under his lashes, the hint of a smirk on his face. Next. But that's the easiest one, I objected. Next, he repeated. I looked down, frustrated. I unrolled my silverware, picked up my fork, and carefully speared a ravioli. I put it in my mouth slowly, still looking down, chewing while I thought. The mushrooms were good. I swallowed and took another sip of Coke before I looked up. Okay then, I glared at him and continued slowly. Let's say, hypothetically of course, that someone could know what people are thinking. Read minds, with a few exceptions. Just one exception, he corrected. Hypothetically. All right, with one exception then. I was thrilled that he was playing along, but I tried to seem casual. How does that work? What are the limitations? How would that someone find someone else at exactly the right time? How would he know she was in trouble? I wondered if my convoluted questions even made sense. Hypothetically, he asked. Sure. Well, if that's someone, let's call him Joe, I suggested. He smiled wryly. Joe, then. If Joe had been paying attention, the timing wouldn't have needed to be quite so exact. He shook his head, rolling his eyes. Only you could get into trouble in a town this small. You would have devastated their crime rate statistics for a decade, you know. We were speaking of a hypothetical case, I reminded him frostily. He laughed at me, his eyes warm. Yes, we were, he agreed. Shall we call you Jane? How did you know? I asked, unable to curb my intensity. I realized I was leaning toward him again. He seemed to be wavering, torn by some internal dilemma. His eyes locked with mine, and I guessed he was making the decision right then whether or not to simply tell me the truth. You can trust me, you know, I murmured. I reached forward, without thinking, to touch his folded hands, but he slid them away minutely, and I pulled my hand back. I don't know if I have a choice anymore. His voice was almost a whisper. I was wrong. You're much more observant than I gave you credit for. I thought you were always right. I used to be. He shook his head again. I was wrong about you on one other thing as well. You're not a magnet for accidents. That's not a broad enough classification. You are a magnet for trouble. If there is anything dangerous within a 10-mile radius, it will invariably find you. And you put yourself into that category, I guessed? His face turned cold, expressionless, unequivocally. I stretched my hand across the table again, ignoring him when he pulled back slightly once more to touch the back of his hand shyly with my fingertips. His skin was cold and hard, like a stone. Thank you. My voice was fervent with gratitude. That's twice now. His face softened. Let's not try for 3. Agreed? I scowled, but nodded. He moved his hand out from under mine, placing both of his under the table, but he leaned toward me. I followed you to Port Angeles, he admitted, speaking in a rush. I've never tried to keep a specific person alive before, and it's much more troublesome than I would have believed. But that's probably just because it's you. Ordinary people seem to make it through the day without so many catastrophes. He paused. I wondered if it should bother me that he was following me. Instead, I felt a strange surge of pleasure. He stared, maybe wondering why my lips were curving into an involuntary smile. Did you ever think that maybe my number was up the first time with the van, and that you've been interfering with fate? I speculated, distracting myself. That wasn't the first time, he said, and his voice was hard to hear. I stared at him in amazement, and he was looking down. Your number was up the first time I met you. I felt the spasm of fear at his words and the abrupt memory of his violent black glare that first day, but the overwhelming sense of safety I felt in his presence stifled it. By the time he looked up to read my eyes, there was no trace of fear in them. You remember? He asked, his angel's face grave. Yes, I was calm. And yet here you sit. There was a trace of disbelief in his voice. He raised one eyebrow. Yes, here I sit, because of you. I paused. Because somehow you knew how to find me today? I prompted. He pressed his lips together, staring at me through narrow eyes, deciding again. His eyes flashed down to my full plate and then back to me. You eat, I'll talk, he bargained. I quickly scooped up another ravioli and popped it in my mouth. It's harder than it should be, keeping track of you. Usually I can find someone very easily once I've heard their mind before. He looked at me anxiously, and I realized I had frozen. I made myself swallow, then stabbed another ravioli and tossed it in. I was keeping tabs on Jessica, not carefully. Like I said, only you could find trouble in Port Angeles. And at first I didn't notice when you took off on your own. Then, when I realized that you weren't with her anymore, I went looking for you at the bookstore I saw in her head. I could tell that you hadn't gone in and that you'd gone south, and I knew you would have to turn around soon. So I was just waiting for you, randomly searching through the thoughts of people on the street to see if anyone had noticed you, so I would know where you were. I had no reason to be worried, but I was strangely anxious. He was lost in thought, staring past me, seeing things I couldn't imagine. I started to drive in circles, still listening. The sun was finally setting, and I was about to get out and follow you on foot, and then he stopped, clenching his teeth together in sudden fury. He made an effort to calm himself. Then what? I whispered. He continued to stare over my head. I heard what they were thinking, he growled, his upper lip curling slightly back over his teeth. I saw your face in his mind. He suddenly leaned forward, one elbow appearing on the table, his hand covering his eyes. The movement was so swift it startled me. It was very hard. You can't imagine how hard. For me to simply take you away and leave them alive. His voice was muffled by his arm. I could have let you go with Jessica and Angela, but I was afraid if you left me alone, I would go looking for them, he admitted in a whisper. I sat quietly, dazed, my thoughts incoherent. My hands were folded in my lap, and I was leaning weakly against the back of the seat. He still had his face in his hands, and he was as still as if he'd been carved from the stone his skin resembled. Finally, he looked up, his eyes seeking mine, full of his own questions. Are you ready to go home? He asked. I'm ready to leave, I qualified, overly grateful that we had the hour-long ride home together. I wasn't ready to say goodbye to him. The waitress appeared as if she'd been called, or watching. How are we doing? She asked Edward. We're ready for the check, thank you. His voice was quiet, rougher, still reflecting the strain of our conversation. It seemed to muddle her. He looked up, waiting. Sure, she stuttered. Here you go. She pulled a small leather folder from the front pocket of her black apron and handed it to him. There was a bill in his hand already. He slipped it into the folder and handed it right back to her. No change, he smiled. Then he stood up, and I scrambled awkwardly to my feet. She smiled invitingly at him again. You have a nice evening. He didn't look away from me as he thanked her. I suppressed a smile. He walked close behind me to the door, still careful not to touch me. I remembered what Jessica had said about her relationship with Mike, how they were almost to the first kiss stage. I sighed. Edward seemed to hear me, and he looked down curiously. I looked at the sidewalk, grateful that he didn't seem to be able to know what I was thinking. He opened the passenger door, holding it for me as I stepped in, shutting it softly behind me. I watched him walk around the front of the car, amazed yet again by how graceful he was. I probably should have been used to that by now, but I wasn't. I had a feeling Edward wasn't the kind of person anyone got used to. Once inside the car, he started the engine and turned the heater on high. It had gotten very cold, and I guessed the good weather was at an end. I was warm in his jacket, though, breathing in the scent of it when I thought he couldn't see. Edward pulled out through the traffic, apparently without a glance, flipping around to head toward the freeway. Now, he said significantly, it's your turn.
Ooh, we got a lot in those chapters.
Yeah.
He basically admitted that he reads people's minds.
Right.
Like... Well, that was fun. That was chapter 7 and 8 of Twilight. Thank you for tuning in to Lunchtime Listens. Thanks for joining me, Christina.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Bye.